All right, it's time to look at switches. We've been talking about routers, but right now let's take a look at a switch. The main thing here is how do we start a switch up? I mean, if we get it out of the box, what do we do and how do we work with it? And starting a switch is going to be as easy as 1, 2, 3. Why? Because what we're going to find here is that switches are going to be installed based on their physical configuration. We have wall mount, we have rack mount, we've got desktop, we've got table, we've got different configurations. And depending on the switch is going to determine how we actually put it into our environment. But once it's in the environment, what we want to do is we want to make certain that we know exactly what's going on when we bring it up and we make it operational. Now, when we look at the front of a switch, what we're going to see is we're going to see a series of LEDs. Let me grab a pin that's actually going to show up here. We see different LEDs. So notice the first LED is the system LED. That's this first one right here. And it's going to give us statuses about different pieces of equipment or different things inside the system. For instance, 2 is going to tell us about the remote power supply. 3 through 6 is going to let us know about port mode LEDs. It's going to also have mode buttons so that we can alter the configuration of it. And it's also going to give us the indication of port status, because for each of these individual links, this one being here, this one being here, what we're going to see here is that these lights are going to light up and give us status associated with our different links themselves. Now all of this is going to take place after the system boots up and goes through post, power on self-test. Also, the power on self-test is going to directly have an impact as to what these indicators are going to be telling us inside the configuration. Now, looking at what's going on, we have different ways and different methods that we can use to connect to our devices. What we have to first recognize is that more often than not, today we're going to use this method right here. It's going to be a serial adapter. But back in the day, you used to use these blue cables. They're called rollover cables. And a rollover cable had a serial port that connected to your laptop, and then you have a RJ45 in that used to connect onto or into the console port on your actual device that you were going to be managing. These things were gold. I've seen network engineers threaten to kill people for walking away with their rollover cables. Now, the problem is this serial connection. As time goes by, what we're finding is the serial connections have disappeared from our laptops. So laptops don't necessarily have serial connections on them anymore, but we got a ton of USB ports. So what we do is now, more often than not, we use a USB to serial converter to be able to get the connectivity to our devices so that we can actually manage it. And what you end up doing is you take your serial interface and you connect it to your rollover cable, and then you have the capability of being able to interconnect and do your configs. Also, something that's not listed here is USB to USB is becoming more and more common. However, the last I checked, Cisco wasn't necessarily supporting it, but the features and the capability is there. I've actually tried it. It seems to work okay. I just don't know if it's something that Cisco would be actually supporting or not. Now, that begs the question. So what would we consider to be basic configurational requirements for our different devices or our switches? So first of all, what we want to do is we want to configure it. To make changes, we need to enter the configuration terminal mode. That's going to be defined by typing configure space terminal, or config, C-O-N-F-I-G space T. Now once we're there, we can make configurational changes. Now Cisco is going to be very, very picky about making certain that we understand what configuration mode we're in. So notice here it says we are in switch config mode. So that tells me that I am in global configuration in my privileged user mode or privileged exec. Now notice here it tells me I am under the interface configuration mode and I'm one level deep from global config. And what's going to happen is based on these different configuration modes, we're going to determine what commands we have available to us when we want to do configurations. So be very mindful. Cisco may come along and say, what command would you use to do X? And what they may do is they may have the proper physical command, but you may not be in the right configurational subcontext. So it may say interface fast Ethernet 01, and it'll just simply say config in parentheses, not config interface. So when you apply your IP address, you would do IP address, whatever the IP address that you wanted to apply, the subnet mask, /24 in this instance. Let me get myself out of the way here. And then what would end up happening is unless you are in the interface configuration mode, this command is not going to take. So Cisco's definitely going to want to make certain that you are aware of where you are in your configurational modes and configs. Now, the other part of this is that we need to also recognize that we need to be able to assign a switch an identity. A switch's identity is going to come into us in the form of a host name. Now, I've seen varying degrees. I just say Catalyst 1, Catalyst 2, Catalyst 3 or 4, or switch 1, 2, 3, or 4. Some places will say for instance, headquarters switch 1 if we have 5 of them. So that name may or may not be indicative of its location inside the infrastructure. But when we look at how it's configured, it's always going to be the same. Whether we're using a router or whether we're using a switch is irrelevant. But again, we're talking specifically about switches. The other thing is we need to be mindful of how we're going to manage our switch. Now, rollover cables are great. Serial adapters so that we can keep using rollover cables are great. But what do I do when the switch that I'm working on is in Texas and I'm in Virginia? All right, the rollover cable is not going to reach. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our VTY sessions in order to be able to do some type of connectivity, and that's going to require us to set up a management VLAN. Now, every port on a switch, when we uncrate it, every port on that switch is going to exist in VLAN 1. Now, VLAN 1 is going to be the ports that the connections go to, but what we're also going to have to recognize is that we also have something called an SVI. That stands for Switched Virtual Interface. So it's a logical interface that can be assigned to a VLAN. So notice here, interface VLAN 1. And we're going to have that by default. So if I wanted to be able to manage this device, I would have a connection to that device going up to, say, another switch, which would be my management switch, where I'd have all of my devices connected. Or what I would end up doing is I would access a router and then on a connection and be able to jump from the router to my switch. And what we're going to find is in the confines of our security conversations, this is going to be something that we want to be able to control, mitigate, and regulate, because we don't want to give everyone access to all of our gear willy-nilly with no issues or no challenge. So when we start looking at how this is implemented, like I said, VLAN 1 is very, very important for us because VLAN 1 allows me to do my management. And like I said, VLAN 1 exists on every device by default, every switch by default. Let's see here. Now, the other thing is like I said, we want to be able to verify our startup. The show version command is a very handy tool because the show version tells me what iOS I'm running, what my particular configuration is with regard to my system image, lets me know about things like my memory, whether or not I've actually passed or failed my post, what my motherboard's serial number is, any number of things that Cisco TAC may ask for, TAC being the Technical Support Center inside the confines of Cisco, and it's going to give me information like how long my device has been running. And we'll look at each of these commands in turn. But the other part of this is we also need to recognize that when we go through, the initial startup is very important, and it's also going to be really important for us to take a look at what's happening on our interfaces. Now what we see here is the result of the show interfaces, Fast Ethernet 01. It's telling me that my Ethernet protocol is up, it's telling me my line protocol is up, and I am connected. It's also giving me information as to my operation. Remember we talked about duplex and full duplex and half duplex and simplex. Well, tells me my connection speed. It even tells me my media type. 1/10 base TX is going to be Fast Ethernet. Notice it gives me a 5-minute input analysis with regard to the number of packets and my throughput. Now we can actually change this with a value called load interval, because 5 minutes is a long time, especially when you're trying to do diagnostics. More often than not, I'll change that to 90 when I'm troubleshooting. But again, it's not something that you guys necessarily need to know in the confines of the CCNA, but definitely something that you probably use in the real world. The other thing is that we can verify all of this. All of these configurations can be verified with the show running configuration command. Show running configuration is the go-to to be able to look at just about everything that is not their direct impact on running configuration. Let me rephrase that. I don't want to say that because the running configuration is the information that's in the router that's based on how it is configured. However, it's not necessarily indicative of the fact that it's doing what we told it to. So show running configuration is going to tell you what your intended configuration is. The show interface commands, the show verifications that we looked at thus far are going to be commands that you're going to use to make certain that your commands that you put into the running config actually have worked and are doing what you want them to. Now, when we look at how this is all implemented and configured, it's really important for us to understand that these interfaces and all of this access stuff is going to be part and parcel of what you're going to need to know, whether you're a CCNA candidate, a CCNP candidate, or even a CCIE candidate. Now, what I'm going to do is very quickly here, I'm going to cut over to my equipment one more time. And let's look at what would be involved in setting up a switch. But my problem is my switches are currently configured, and I want to remedy that. So let's walk through this entire process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say write erase, and I'm going to get rid of the switches configuration. I'm going to say delete a file called vlan.dat, which is a file we'll talk about later on with regard to where information is stored and associated with virtual local area networks. Not just LANs, but VLANs. So I'm going to get rid of that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the router, now that you don't have a startup configuration, I want you to reload. So I'm going to type reload. Now the system is going to ask me if I really want to do that. Sometimes the system will come up and say, you have a running configuration, would you like to save it because you don't have a startup configuration? And the answer in this scenario is no, because I want to come up as a fresh start. And as we do this, what you're going to see is exactly what's going to be happening, and I'm going to walk through this real time. It will take a little bit, but the main thing here is I want you to see everything that's going to be part and parcel of this installation process. Now notice it tells me it's initializing the flash. Password recovery mechanism is enabled. Gives me my base MAC address. Remember, I told you every interface has a MAC address. Well, every Ethernet device has a MAC address also, in the confines of switching. Notice it's telling me things about what's going on, and now it is decompressing. That's what all of these ampersands are. It's taking the bin file, which is zipped up, and it's decompressing it and actually loading it into RAM. This information is stored in eNVRAM on the flash. So what's happening now is it's actually taking it, it's decompressing it. Now once it's decompressed, it's going to be able to now bootstrap itself. So again, we'll actually walk through this process, and like I said, it's going to take a little bit of time, but it's not interminable, and it's actually, in my opinion, exceedingly important for you guys to understand what's happening with the system. So again, CCNA is, a lot of people for the longest time used to think that CCNA was just super simple. And in all honesty, it's not. Now you can see very shortly there, a minute there, it went up. Now notice right now, notice it's going through post, power on self-test. It's checking each of these components as it goes through. If it passes all of these components, or if it fails and it doesn't indicate that it can't boot, then what will happen is it will actually go through the process and it's going to bring the system up. So notice here it says checking for bootloader upgrade, not needed. Now it's implementing all of these post tests. It's looking at port ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits. It's looking at the CPU configuration. Now what it's going to do is it's going to wait for the ports to download. It's bringing itself up. Here's the operating system that it's running on. There's the iOS behind me, right here. This is the model. It's a 3560 24-port switch. And ultimately, it's going to dump me out into a configuration wizard. A configuration wizard I rarely ever use. In fact, I couldn't even walk you through it. So press start to begin. Okay. Bringing up all the interfaces, verifying everything. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to do the config here. I'm going to take myself off the camera. And it's going to say, would you like to enter initial configuration dialog? I'm going to say no because I don't want it to do anything in the background. And notice now it's putting me in user exec mode. And notice I have a name of switch. Well, let's change this stuff. First of all, I want to be able to configure this device. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say enable, and that's going to put me into my privileged exec mode. So first thing I'm going to do is config T, configure, I'll go ahead and spell it out, configure terminal. And I'm going to say I want to change the name of this switch, so I'm going to give it a host name. I will use cat1 as my host name. Now, do show run. Now, let's take a look at what our configuration tells us. And what I want to do is I want to show you that by default, we should have an SVI, Interface VLAN 1. It exists in the system. By default, we have no IP address for it. Now, this is my management interface. I don't always have to use it as my management interface. In fact, in live deployments, you're going to find a situation where you're not going to use VLAN 1 for anything. You're going to pick another VLAN, and you're going to use it for your management VLAN. But the main thing that you need to understand here is that every port on this device exists in VLAN 1. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to do another command. I haven't shown it yet. So what I want to do is show, and I'm going to say interface FA01. I'm going to hit enter, and it's not going to work because what you're supposed to do when you use that command or any of the show commands, you need to be in the base exec mode, or the privileged exec mode. So now if I come up here and do show interface FA01, it's going to give me the input. Well, what I want to do is I'm going to do show or show run interface FA01, and it'll do the same thing. It's going to give me the output of the show command. If I want to use a show command without having to go all the way back here to the privileged exec mode, I use the do command. Call it doing the do. So here it's going to be do show interface fast Ethernet or show run interface FA01. And there we go. Now here's the issue. I forget the command. I just got finished for 20 minutes harping about the benefits of context sensitive help. The moment you type do show, you don't have any other information. Let's see, do show run. Notice I can't autocomplete. Running dash config. And I want to look at interface. No context sensitive help. No error. All it's going to do is tell me line. So interface FA01. And I can still see the command. So when you use the do command without having to exit out to the privileged exec mode, you do not have the advantage of having your context sensitive help. So sometimes when I'm doing a demo or doing an explanation, I'll forget and I'll actually have to go back so that I can use the context-sensitive help. Yes, even CCIEs rely on the context-sensitive help, because what you're going to find is that the difference between being a CCNA and a CCNP is pretty much the same as being a CCIE and a CCNP. And that is the fact that the only real difference is the length and breadth of your knowledge and the speed at which you can identify your own problems. So looking at this, like I said, we've configured a host name. We've configured we've looked at the VLAN. Let's go ahead and set up a management VLAN. So I'm going to say interface VLAN 1. I'm going to give it an IP address. IP address 10, let's say 7.7.7.7.255.255.255.0. No shut. Not necessary, but I've got a bad habit of doing it because in the exam sometimes they turn interfaces off. And what we're going to see here now, if I do show run interface VLAN 1 and hit enter, now you're going to see the information that I configured. The other command we saw was show version. The show version command gives me a lot of information. It gives me, first of all, my platform, lets me know what release of my iOS that I'm running. Here's the release of the bootloader, 44. All right, that needs to get updated. Somebody needs to look at that. But the whole idea is notice it's been up for 5 minutes. Gives me where the information was stored. It was stored on my flash. Also, when I get down to the bottom, it's going to give me all of the detailed information associated with the post. It's going to tell me everything with regard to my software image that I've got running, and it's also going to give me information associated with my configuration register settings. The configuration register, we'll talk about configuration register when we discuss password recovery, but the main thing here is it's all going to be just a hexadecimal value that's going to tell the router how to behave when it boots. So by default, it's going to load the startup config. I may not want it to, and I can alter the configuration register values in order to be able to prevent that. So this walks us through exactly what we need to do at the basics, very beginning, out of the box configuration. Once our switch has been slapped on the wall, inserted into the rack, or centered positioned in the middle of a desk, and we start hooking cables up to it, we talked about how we would connect to be able to manage it, and we would also talk about how we would bypass or get rid of the issue of not being able to reach it with a console cable or even a USB cable with regard to doing maintenance, and that's going to require that management VLAN. Now, it used to be in the old days of Catalyst switches that you could only manage an interface or manage a device on its management interface. That's not true anymore. In the confines of the current version of iOS running on our Catalyst switches and on our ISR devices, any IP address that exists on the system can be used by default for the purposes of administrating the box itself. So that covers the basics of how to set up a switch. I'll see you guys in the next session. Bye-bye.